morning I'd like to share with you some observations concerning the graves of two men. They both had lived in Egypt and both died young. They both were kings and both have become much more renowned in death than in life. First, there is the tomb of Tutankhamun. This tomb was discovered in 1922 by the British archaeologist Howard Carter. It represents the most complete and least disturbed burial site of any ancient Egyptian pharaoh. Tutankhamun, also known more familiarly perhaps as King Tut, lived in the mid-1300s BC, perhaps a century or maybe a century and a half after Moses. He was a relatively unimportant figure in Egyptian history. It may be explained by the fact that he became king at the age of 9, but died at the age of 18. But strangely enough, it's the very fact of his unimportance that made him famous. Because you see, while the greatest pharaohs were buried in elaborate tombs among magnificent pyramids, which were easily sighted and subsequently plundered and spoiled by Egypt's conquerors, Tutankhamun's man was unnoticed. His tomb was undisturbed for 33 centuries, nearly 3,500 years. Now, though it was obviously austere in comparison to the resting places of the truly great pharaohs, even so, this tomb comprised several rooms containing over 5,000 personal belongings of the king. Many, by the way, which were fashioned from solid gold. Some of you may remember for 3 years, from 1976 to 1979, King Tut's treasures were brought to this country. Billed as the most impressive and beautiful exhibit of ancient art ever to come to the United States. But did you know that King Tutankhamun is coming back? Yes, starting this June. King Tut's making an encore trip to Washington, D.C., Boston, Los Angeles, Fort Lauderdale, Chicago, and Philadelphia. They'll run into 2023. Now, beyond the hoopla that followed King Tut in the 1970s, and I'm sure the hype that will appear very quickly in our near future, there's actually a message that comes from Tut's tomb. For although it was filled with inscriptions speaking of life and countless objects that were meant to sustain life, there was no life in that place. Like your typical tomb, it held imprisoned the mummified remains of a man who talked of life, a man who wished for immortality, but who was in fact dead. An inscription on Tut's tomb reads, "May your spirit live, and may your eyes behold happiness." But no life was found in that place. Neither was happiness. Certainly, Tutankhamun had hopes, but they were just as empty as the containers of food left in that dark depository for a departed despot. His power to defeat death was as ineffectual as the statues of the gods that attended him, as the feudal paintings scattered throughout the burial site of his servants, awaiting to do whatever their master bid. So for Tut's tomb. But second, there is the crypt of Christ. This tomb was discovered one Sunday morning just as dawn broke. It was in the spring of the year 29 AD. Quite unlike Tutankhamun's tomb, Christ's crypt was nothing more than a sleeping room for a weekend transient. There were no statues of the gods, no elaborate paintings of golden face masks. This burial site didn't have so much as a single inscription etched on it, inside or out. And why would it be any other way? The only inscription that could have been written was, "He is not here." Here's an interesting note. When the garden tomb, today believed to be the sepulchre in which Jesus was laid, was discovered in 1885 by the British General Charles G. Gordon, it was covered with rubbish 20 feet high. And so they first cleared the spot with a great deal of caution, and then gathered all of the dust and even the debris within the tomb and shipped it to the Scientific Association of Great Britain. There, every particle was analyzed, but even so, they did not find a single trace of human remains. Now, if this site is the actual crypt of Christ, then Jesus was the first to be laid there, as Luke tells us in his gospel. And Jesus was also the last. And so Christ's empty tomb calls forth the consideration of all people from that very first Easter until today. In the 1700s, Lord Lyttelton and Gilbert West joined forces to once and for all expose what they considered to be the myth of Easter. But after several years of research, rather than finding evidence to destroy Christianity, they were both converted to the faith. In the 1800s, United States General Lew Wallace determined to write a book which would prove Christianity to be false. Again, after much study, research, while writing the second chapter of his book, Lew Wallace confessed, "I fell on my knees, crying to Jesus of Nazareth, my Lord and my God." Following the Civil War, Lew Wallace completed the literary work, but it didn't turn out to be an attack on Christianity. Rather, it was an evangelistic piece, perhaps the greatest Christian novel ever written, Ben-Hur, the story of the Christ. In the 1900s, scholars like Cyril T. Joad and C.S. Lewis doubted Christ's claims of deity and the power of his resurrection. But in time, they too, after honest investigation and a thorough sifting of the facts, came to faith in Jesus Christ and emerged, both of them, as faithful and effective witnesses to Christianity. A lawyer named Frank Morrison has written a book he entitled, "Who Moved the Stone?" Its purpose was to disprove the resurrection by demonstrating that Christ really didn't rise from the grave. But the book turned out to do just the opposite. In its searching of the scriptures, in the biblical account of the story of Jesus' crucifixion, his burial and resurrection, Morrison suddenly makes the unquestionable point that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is indeed a historical fact. In the matter of a court case, he disposes of dozens of theories invented to account for the absence of Jesus' body in the grave. For example, that Jesus only swooned on the cross, and when he was placed in the cool sepulchre, he revived. Or that Joseph of Arimathea removed the body because he regretted giving his grave to an acknowledged criminal. Yes, there's a world of difference between the tomb of Tutankhamun and the crypt of Christ. But that difference is not only in their content, but even more so in their meaning. King Tut died because, like Adam, all mortals die. King Jesus died, yes, but only that through death he might render powerless the one who had the power of death, even the devil. Jesus personally confronted death, determined to crush it in its grip. He willingly permitted his body to become a lifeless corpse, buried in a crypt, asserting, as he said in John chapter 10, "I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one can take it from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. Yes, I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it back again." Death, which counted Jesus as its victim, suffered for the sins of the world as he hung on the cross. But suddenly, death lost its power to hold him any longer. And as he triumphantly led captivity captive, he declared, "I'm the living one. I was dead, yes, and yet now I am alive forever, and I have the keys of death and hell." Revelation chapter 1. You see, the discoverers of Jesus' resting place tell us that the only contents in the tomb were two pieces of linen. They were used to wrap his crucified body. John tells us the linen shroud as it lay, and a face cloth which had been around his head, not lying with the linen shroud, but rolled up in a place by itself. The picture that's portrayed here is black grave clothes, deflated by the absence of a corpse, the greater portion thereof laying on a slab bench, and then the head bandage on a sort of a stone pillow. Now, unlike Lazarus, who came forth from his burial place, as it's recorded, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face enshrouded with a cloth, Jesus left his burial garments behind because he would never need them ever again. Jesus lives forever. The empty crypt of Christ declares that he is everything he ever claimed to be, as we read in Romans 1. Our Lord Jesus Christ, in his human nature, was a descendant of David, yet being raised from the dead, he is decisively declared to be the mighty Son of God, with a holy nature of God himself. Now, let's be honest. There have been a lot of others who claimed that they would come back from the dead so as to communicate with the living. Houdini, the renowned magician and escape artist, promised to contact his wife within 7 years after his death, but she had to acknowledge that it never happened. Clarence Darrow, the famed defense attorney for the John T. Scopes monkey trial, remember in Cleveland, Tennessee, where there was a lawsuit about teaching evolution in the classroom? Well, Clarence Darrow had a close friend, an associate named Claude Noble, and they agreed to contact one another after Darrow's death. Twice, Noble tried to reach Darrow. The first time on March 13th, 1939, the first anniversary of Clarence Darrow's death. This was attempted in a Detroit hotel room where their covenant had been made the previous year. But it didn't succeed. A year later, a second attempt was tried as Noble stood over a lagoon in Chicago's Jackson Park, chanting, "Clarence Darrow, I'm here in fulfillment of the promise we made to each other. Clarence Darrow, I'm here. If you would manifest your spirit to me, do it now." Of course, this attempt also failed. On the other hand, if Jesus of Nazareth, who had repeatedly said that he would come back to life bodily, if his failure to rise would have nullified every claim that he ever made, certainly those to be God in the flesh. Now, from time to time, you read about someone claiming to find remains of some great leader or historical figure. But the truth is, if 1 ounce of Jesus' bones or body were ever to be found, Christianity would immediately fall to pieces. The contents of Tutankhamun's tomb have brought amazement to everyone who's ever seen them. But the crypt of Christ goes far beyond that, because the crypt of Christ assures us, it declares again and again, God is going to have the last word in this world. You high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, God is going to have the last word. Yes, Governor Pilate, Pontius Pilate, God is going to have the last word. Vladimir Putin, God is going to have the last word. Satan, God is going to have the last word. From Christ's tomb, God challenges science, saying, explain this event. He challenges history, saying, repeat this event. He challenges time, saying, blot out this event. And all the while, Christ's empty tomb calls people everywhere declaring, I bring life to all who believe. On Easter before he died, D.W. Sangster painfully printed a note to his daughter. Sangster had been a very dynamic, deeply spiritual Methodist preacher who had spearheaded a renewal movement in Great Britain following World War II. But then his ministry, except for prayer, was ended by a disease which progressively paralyzed his body, even his vocal cords. But the last Easter he spent on earth, barely able to move his fingers, he wrote to his daughter, how terrible to wake up on Easter and have no voice. No voice to shout, he is risen. But far worse, to have a voice and not want to shout. Truly, Christ is risen from the dead. The first of millions who someday will empty their graves. And my friends, that's something to shout about. That's something to sing about. It's something to live for. Hallelujah. Christ arose.
Amen. Amen.
Our